It's probably worth saying by way of background that this is a kind of agenda that is very much in the DNA of the Royal Statistical Society. If you go back really through our history, presidents such as Booth and Beveridge have been deeply concerned with questions about how we measure the social status of society, and in particular those who are worst off. And it's fascinating to see that these questions continue right through to today, and I'm delighted that the Society continues to play an active role in debating these questions and bringing people together. So today we've got a really great panel for you to help shed light on these questions. First of all, Peter Matejic from the Child Poverty Unit, and then Matt Tinsley, who's a research fellow in the Economics Unit at Policy Exchange, a centre-right think tank. Matt Barnes, who's at the National Centre for Social Research, and then finally John Veit-Wilson, who's Professor of Sociology, Social Policy at Northumbria University and Visiting Professor in Sociology at Newcastle University. He's also Vice Chair of the Child Poverty Action Group, of which he was a founder member in 1965. So I'm going to ask Peter to kick off with a 10-minute presentation. He's going to set the scene, give us an overview of existing measures, and update us on the consultation process. So there's a government consultation that's been underway on this issue in recent months.
Okay, thank you, Hetan. I'm Peter Matejic, as Hetan said. I'm a statistician in DWP's Child Poverty Unit, and I've worked on a range of poverty statistics over about the last 10 years. And what I'm here to do is to set the context in terms of how we currently measure child poverty and the consultation on improving how we might measure child poverty. So the government is committed to tackling child poverty. There's cross-party backing for tackling child poverty. And the government remains committed to the Child Poverty Act, and I'll go through some of the Child Poverty Act targets on the next slide. And they're focused on action that will improve the lives of poor children. So a lot is being done. There's the introduction of universal credit, which will improve the lives of some of the poorest families in society. And also we've introduced the pupil premium to raise educational attainment of poor children. And we've also introduced free early education of 20% of the most deprived children from September 2013, rising to 40% from September 2014. But I should sort of start by setting out what are the measures in the Child Poverty Act. So the Child Poverty Act passed in 2010 with cross-party support, as I previously mentioned, and it consists of 4 targets. The first target is relative low income, and relative low income is measured by households whose incomes are less than 6% of the current median income, and the target is less than 10%. And what we do here is we equivalize incomes to make sure that we're comparing the same sizes of households with the same sizes of households, so we're comparing like with like. So for instance, a bigger household will need more money to maintain the same standard of living. And what we do is we work out the median income of such adjusted income and take 60% of that and see how many households are below that income level. And that target will fall if low-income households see their incomes rise faster than the average household or the median household. We've then got a combined relative low-income and material deprivation measure, which is the target of less than 5%, and this takes a 7% of median income threshold and applies a material deprivation measure to it. And the material deprivation measure is based on whether families have 21 items or services at both adult and child level. And if they're lacking an item because they can't afford it, the more items they lack, the higher the material deprivation score. And if they're in relative low income based on 70% and in material deprivation, then they are counted in this measure. Third one is absolute low income, where the household income is less than 60% of the 10-11 median income adjusted for inflation. And this is a measure that will go down if the incomes of the lowest income people are rising faster than inflation. And finally, the fourth one is persistent poverty, because incomes are dynamic and can go up and down over time, and this is a measure that looks at changes over time. So if you're below in relative low income for 3 out of 4 years or 4 out of 4 years, then you're in persistent poverty. The first 3 measures are measured using the DWP's Family Resources Survey. The fourth one, we haven't been able to set a target yet because it used to be measured using something called the British Household Panel Survey, which has now been subsumed into a bigger survey called Understanding Society. And of course, we want to wait for the data to be available before we can see what is a suitable target level. So with all those measures, why were we consulting on better measures of child poverty? Well, we think if we're going to successfully end child poverty, we must be able to measure it, understand the drivers, and tackle the root causes. So we think that the government thinks that the current measures have some shortcomings. In 2011-10, there was obviously a recession, we all know that, and in a recession you might expect poverty to increase. But because of the fact that relative poverty is based on the median, if the median falls faster than the incomes of the poorest, then relative poverty falls. And we saw quite a statistically significant decrease in relative poverty during the recession, which is a strange result. Also, the absolute poverty line depends on exactly how you're going to uprate that income, and you have to choose a suitable inflation index, and at the moment we're looking to see what is the best inflation index. Measures also overlook other resources, for instance, assets or other resources available to households. It also doesn't sort of distinguish between households that are temporarily in poverty, perhaps just in between jobs or just fell on hard times for a short period of time, and those that are stuck there for a long time. And we think we can do better in getting a handle on that. And finally, they don't identify intergenerational poverty. So it doesn't incentivize action to stop poor children becoming poor adults. And that's why we started the consultation. So the consultation ran from November 2012 to February 2013. We asked for a response, and some of our criteria for a suitable measure of child poverty was that they should be accepted by the public and experts as being a fair representation of those children that are growing up in poverty, and they should be methodologically robust and draw on the best available data. We ran a series of events involving over 400 people, including children themselves, and we also received a lot of consultation responses, including from hopefully many people in the rooms and obviously many of the people on the panel. And we're grateful for everybody who's taken part in these events. So what have we identified in terms of responses? Well, sort of obviously, there's no perfect measure in this sphere. Different measures are suitable for different purposes. And there was very much support of the measures in the Child Poverty Act. There was support, though, for developing our understanding of poverty beyond these measures. There's also quite a lot of concern about conflating causes, consequences, and definitions of poverty. And some of my next two slides will come through trying to sort of unpick some of that. We also think there's value in looking at poverty now and future life chances so that we can sort of break the intergenerational cycle and also help people now. And I think it is really important to think about who needs that help, who are stuck in poverty for longer, and who've got their own resources to be able to get out of poverty. And the final thing is that income should continue to be a key feature of any measure of child poverty. We're working across government on the next steps. It's a complex issue, and we're not going to rush to a decision, so that's why we haven't done a formal response yet to the consultation. So, what do we think is important to measure in terms of poverty now? Well, we think it's important to try and distinguish between who's stuck in poverty for a short period and who's stuck there for a longer period. So what we've done following the consultation is conducted an extensive internal review of evidence in this area, as well as trying to engage with academics in the field. And what we've been looking to do is to identify drivers of entrenched poverty, and that's what we're calling entrenched poverty is in low income now and likely to be there for some time. And what we can see is that it's clear that work, wherever possible, is the best way out of poverty. Obviously, that work has to be of sufficient hours and of sufficient remuneration, but that's the most sustainable way out of poverty. And the diagram here sets out some of the key family characteristics that we think mean families are likely to stay in poverty for longer. I must emphasise that these are risks rather than destinies, so sort of not all people with low parental qualifications have their children in poverty, not all people with addiction problems have their children in poverty, but that the risks are higher when these characteristics are present. And what we think is they mainly act through worklessness and low earnings. And this is seen in all of the Child Poverty Act targets where the worklessness statistics, the rates of poverty for those who are workless is much higher than those that are in work. And you'll see that addiction is in red. I think that's because the evidence there is of a different type, and we don't think it's easily capturable in the main social surveys that we use, that it can have a devastating effect, but it only affects far fewer households than those other ones listed. And I think what we can see is it all acts through the labour market, so low parental qualifications makes it harder to get a job, and harder to get a job of enough remuneration or enough hours. Similarly, family instability and larger families means that there's a bigger degree of childcare responsibilities, hence limiting the ability to work or the number of hours that people can work. But we don't think it's just about tackling poverty now. We think it's also important to tackle the intergenerational cycle of poverty. And we think this is, based on the extensive review of the evidence, is about improving child educational outcomes. We can see that if you get poor qualifications as a child, as we see from the previous diagram, it limits your employment outcomes at adulthood, and then that generates future low income. But there are things that contribute to that low child educational outcomes, such as poverty itself, low parental qualifications, parental ill health, child ill health, the home environment in terms of whether parents read to the child, sort of space for homework and so forth, and low non-cognitive skills for the child, which is sort of the behavioural status of the child and sort of the ability to learn. And we can see that that these characteristics do make a difference. So the EPE report Performing Against the Odds found that children succeeded against the odds, so disadvantaged children achieving better results than expected, had parents with high non-cognitive skills and aspirations, provided high-quality home environment, and sent their children to high-quality preschool. So we think it's really important to identify these drivers of child poverty. We think we need any new measures to reflect these drivers, and they need to feed into our next key milestone in the Child Poverty Unit, which is the Child Poverty Strategy, which is a legislative requirement on the Child Poverty Unit to develop, which needs to be published by spring 2014 and cover the period 2014 to 2017. And what we want to do is to feed in some of these thoughts about the drivers into our consultation for the strategy, which we plan to launch later in the year. And hopefully some of the people in the room can respond to that consultation. We would really appreciate it. So what are our next steps as the Child Poverty Unit? We're hoping to put in place a strategy that tackles the root causes of child poverty. And as I say, we're consulting on that later this year. We also need the right measures to deliver the right action to tackle poverty, targeting those most in need of support. And again, thank you everybody for your responses to the consultation, which has helped build up this understanding. We want to work with experts in any new measures and on the new strategy. We want to reach out to frontline workers, academics, experts in the area, so that we've got the best evidence and the best ideas. We also need to take account of the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission. This is an independent body chaired by Alan Milburn, whose first report is due in the autumn, and we'll have to feed that into our strategy thinking. So that's what the Child Poverty Unit has been doing over the last year. As I say, we are hoping to develop new measures that will feed into the strategy, and that strategy will focus on what we're doing to tackle child poverty over the next 3 years and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's very helpful in setting the scene and helping us understand why this is a kind of current issue given the government consultation. Next off is Matt Tinsley from the Policy Exchange think tank, and Matt is going to be telling us a bit about making the case for why better measures are needed and why multi-dimensional measures can be very helpful. And Policy Exchange is widely known to be a very influential think tank, and I think has fed into the thinking that's led to some of the government consultations. So hearing from you will be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as I kind of was alluded to there, we've been looking at this for quite a while. A lot of the analysis I'm going to go through today is stuff that we've been working on for a couple of years. We released a report in January feeding into the consultation, but also outlining in quite a, well, most of the analysis there outlined the kind of the current measure and our criticisms of it. I focused in this analysis, and I'm focusing today on the headline measure of child poverty, the 60% of median income equivalised for household size or household composition. My reasons for focusing on that is that, and I think the response when you do focus on this measure is that there are a range of measures. I think that the way the media pick it up and the way that politicians respond to the current Child Poverty Act focuses on this one measure of child poverty. And it is not referred to in the media as relative low income. It is referred to as child poverty, and so that's what we focus on here. On top of this, the other measures are all grounded in income, the other three measures. And so a lot of the issues we come up that I'll demonstrate here, I think are relevant with those as well. In terms of what we would like from a measure, I think that there are a range of characteristics we would quite like to see. Some of these are quite obvious. We want to accurately identify what we consider poverty to be, whatever the issue that we're trying to solve and obviously measure over time. Part of the issue we have is that I think leading into the late 90s movement on this and the Child Poverty Act in 2010, there was not a huge amount of debate about what poverty actually was and therefore how we should measure it. In terms of identifying the problem, we also want some level of comparability over time. We want to know how poverty is changing. This is especially important given the media response to a lot of this, given that there's always kind of poverty has increased or decreased, or it will increase or decrease. We don't want to discriminate. We want to be able to identify individuals with regards to their background or situation, given their living standards, or we want to identify their living standards given those factors. And a couple of other factors as well. We don't want it to be open to manipulation from government, and we don't want it to be direct, distorted incentives. These are less statistical, but I think still important. And also, we would like some level of depth to understand what's actually happening. So as Peter highlighted, there have been some strange patterns recently. We can see the grey line there has seen child poverty fall at the same time as relative low income, which is obviously based in 2010-2011, has risen. So there's a bit of a distortion. But actually, for me, the more interesting part of this graph is towards the beginning and towards the middle. We can see towards the beginning, absolute low income fell quite sharply. What that tells us is that relative to a fixed base, the incomes of households towards the bottom of the distribution were rising relatively sharply, but actually relative low income didn't rise at all. And the reason for that is that the median, the baseline that we judge poverty against, was rising relatively fast. The late 90s and early 2000s saw a lot faster wage growth than in the following kind of 7 or 8 years. As income flatlined, we can see the same thing happened at the low end of the distribution. So we had this flatlining in absolute low income to some extent anyway, as a slight decline from kind of the 2002-3 to 2008-9. But it has, compared to those gains that were made, it flatlined a lot. Now, the problem with this is that looking at the grey line, the relative low income line, we can't actually tell a huge amount. If we look at the first 5 years of that, we see a relatively slight decrease. If we look from about 2004-5, maybe 2008-9, we also see a very similar pattern, despite the fact that the actual living standards in terms of income, real income, coming to households, show a very different pattern. So looking over time, we don't actually, given that headline measure, and given the changes in child poverty that are often highlighted by the media, we don't actually learn a huge amount, and it's usually distorted by the baseline income levels that it's compared against. The next area, this is comparing it to a couple of other measures. We've here isolated the material deprivation measure from the households below average income data set. This is not quite the measure that Peter mentioned. The measure in the Act combines that with a low income measure. This is just material deprivation. It covers more children than relative low income or relative income poverty, as I have it here. But as you can see, the overlap isn't that great. There are a huge number of children picked up by material deprivation who are nowhere, or who are certainly not in low income. And so there's something else going on. As I said, the material deprivation measure covers more, but the correlation between the two is actually quite weak. Actually, the correlation between worklessness and material deprivation is stronger, which suggests to me that there are some underlying problems in the relative low income measure, which we define as poverty. as I said, the baselines are higher, but you can see the differences from the mean. The pink lines there are material deprivation, and the kind of the orange lines are relative income poverty or relative low income. As you can see, couples with children, we seem to be overestimating the problem. The kind of difference between the two lines is nowhere as great as we'd expect, given the size of the whole population who experience low income or material deprivation. Single parents with children see really significant differences in the fact that material deprivation is much higher. Now, part of this is the equivalisation that Peter mentioned. We assume what households need, we assume the income they need, we have a weighting factor which we effectively change their own household poverty line. Now, there's something going wrong here in that we are massively probably underestimating the needs of single parent households and overestimating the needs of couples with children. And the result of that is that when we look at the headline poverty statistics, we are underestimating the problems of single parent households. And the same pattern is kind of apparent when you look at pensioner couples or single pensioners with children. An extension of this problem is that we underestimate the issues of households with the most children, so 4 or 5 children. We can see that actually 1, 2 and 3 child households are relatively, the two measures are relatively accurate. And the reason I'm comparing to material deprivation here is that this is a direct measure of what families can or cannot afford. It's not a translation of income into something, a measure of living standards. It is trying to measure living standards directly. So a lot of these issues which come with trying to convert income into a measure of living standards don't appear. And so we can see that actually a lot of the largest households with 4 or 5 children have really significant issues of material deprivation, and these issues are do not exist in relative income poverty. So yet again, there is an issue with using income and trying to translate that into living standards. To a certain extent, this is also true at the regional level. We can see London has below average relative income poverty, but significantly above average material deprivation among children. So again, we are using the current headline measure, we're underestimating the issues in London. In Wales or Scotland, we have on average or slightly above average relative income poverty. We have a below average material deprivation. And the consequence of that is that we are overestimating the problems to some extent using this headline measure. And again, that's more a problem of clearly regional differences in prices and the cost of living. So these factors are usually used to create quite a debate around the types of households and the types of situations that people in poverty are in. Now, one of the debates we see quite a lot is that work is not a way out of poverty. And this is usually used by the fact that around 60% of households on relative low income are in work. However, the kind of effort to dig down below this, it doesn't usually happen. We can see that the hours worked by families in relative low income, families in work in relative low income are generally tend to be significantly fewer to those not in relative low income. So the issue is not necessarily being in work or not being in work, but it's within work. It's the number of hours worked, maybe issues with childcare. And so there's a clear issue, I think, in the current bank of measures in that they do not identify the reasons for families getting to that situation. So I guess my fundamental criticisms are that there are distortions over time. There is, in my view, no statistical validity in comparing child poverty in one year to child poverty in another year, given that it's a relative measure, and given that median income has rose so quickly in the late 90s and early 2000s and has fallen very sharply quite recently. Also, comparable measures of living standards which don't have the issues that income measures have do not overlap very successfully and show distortions and exaggerations when we're looking at different types of households in different parts of the country. I think it covers up complex background factors, which hopefully the consultation reports and recommends to the government will account for. And I think more broadly we have an issue that an income measure is very susceptible to all of these failures in a way that some direct identifications of living standards and material wealth or material income, also all consumption, do not have. And I think this is a failure which we see broadly across the entire range of measures in the Act. Finally, in terms of what we need, we think we need instead, obviously haven't focused on that particularly in this presentation. I think we start need to define what we mean as poverty. I think a lot of the charities focusing on this tend to see poverty as simply something of income. I think if a lot of people would identify poverty as an issue of living standards, the fact that income doesn't translate very effectively into living standards, especially around the margins of who do we count as in or out, is a major issue, and means our understanding of who are facing the most living standards issues is distorted. As I said, there's a statistical robustness we would like, and I think we need some sort of grounding which removes the time distortions we see. Now, I'm aware, I think one of the issues is there is no perfect measure. I think the current measure that we are using and we define is being defined as poverty, as well as the other measures which are based in income, is susceptible to far too many flaws, and we need another headline measure. Now, there are a number of ways we can do that I think would see fewer issues, and I think hopefully we get into the discussion of that during the discussion section.
Thank you very much. And there's some fascinating parallels here with the sorts of discussions that have gone on in the international development movement around what is it that you're actually trying to measure in an underlying sense. And as a plug for later on, we're having a session on measures of progress in international development. So if it's a theme you're interested in, do come along. Now, from one Matt to another, now to Matt Barnes from NatCen. And he's going to talk to us a bit about some research that NatCen did in association with the think tank Demos about a multidimensional approach to poverty and how that helped or didn't help cast light on the issues. Matt.
Okay, thank you very much. As Hetan says, I want to talk about a research project that we did last year to try and understand poverty from a multi-dimensional perspective. So we've heard already about the rationale for why we want to understand poverty multi-dimensionally. And this project actually started before the consultation. And what we wanted to do was really understand and dig a bit deeper into the premise that living in poverty is about much more than just having a low income. Now, we know that poverty is generally measured according to low income, and that's a very sort of indirect measure, and it's designed to be that. And what we wanted to do was look at poverty more directly. And part of the multidimensional rationale was that we understand that poor households face multiple sets of problems, but also different households face different sets of problems. So we wanted to try and identify that in our research, and we wanted to produce analysis that really helped understand and visualize this lived experience of poverty. What we thought that would do was help promote different kinds of policy solutions. So instead of policy solutions that are targeting and aimed around increasing income, we could try and make them a bit cleverer and try and sort of segment families according to the different situations that they face, and then potentially have policy solutions tailored to those different experiences. So it's quite a complicated project in terms of different types of methodology, and I'll just quickly flick through those. So the first stage, we had some engagement with stakeholders and with the public via some polling that Demos did, and we looked at the academic literature to really understand what poverty means and the kind of measures that you can use to picture and understand poverty. And actually what came out most strongly from that was that low income is fundamental to the notion of poverty, but in itself it doesn't describe all these experiences of living in poverty. The second stage was to do some secondary analysis of the Understanding Society data set to create poverty types, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail later. But after we'd created these types in the data, we then did some qualitative interviews with families in different types to get them to see if our sort of poverty types stacked up, and also to speak to families about their varying experiences of poverty and what how they got into those situations and what kind of things they think is required to help them escape from poverty. Demos then helped us to develop a toolkit to try and translate our poverty types to policymakers and work out different policy solutions for each of our different types. And we also went and spoke with local authorities and service providers to see if they understood our poverty types, to see whether they recognised the types of poverty that we'd identified in their local area, and also try to talk to them about the kind of data that they have, which is different from these large household surveys. They have very different types of local level data, and whether they could use their data to try and create typologies in the same way that we did. Okay, so I want to focus on the sort of statistical analysis we did to create the poverty types. So we used the Understanding Society data set. Peter's already said that this kind of superseded the British Household Panel survey. So this Understanding Society is this huge, large-scale survey of 40,000 households in the UK, and it contains a huge range of demographic, social and economic data. And we, from the previous stage of the project where we identified the kind of things you need to understand what poverty is, set up a range of indicators, and there's infographics for the range of 20 indicators that we set out, and they cover various different domains, so not only finance, economic indicators, material deprivation, but also things like work and education, housing, health and well-being, social networks, the resources, the situations of your local area and neighbourhoods. These are all the kind of things that when we spoke to the public and stakeholders said that you really need to get a grip on to really understand and picture what it's like living in poverty in the UK today. So, in terms of creating our poverty types, what we wanted to do was create poverty types that are formed by these unique sort of combinations of these poverty indicators that low-income households had. So we used, well, first of all, we focused just on low income. So this is the sort of a key thing to the definition, because everyone said low income was fundamental to understanding poverty. We only looked at income-poor households. Once we had those households, so we selected those in our data set, and we used the 70% of median income as our sort of poverty threshold, which is the same as the income and material deprivation measure that Peter's outlined. Once we isolated those households in our data, we then ran a latent class analysis to try and create these typologies. And so that produces different clusters or types of households according to the particular combinations of those previous poverty indicators that they have. So, for example, we might find a poverty type that is workless, that has people with mental health problems who worry about their finances as well as being on low income. We might have another type that again has low income. All these households are poor, but they have a different set of poverty indicators. They have things like low skills, poor housing, a lack of social support, and so on. So what you're doing is kind of segmenting this low income population, but identifying households that have quite different sets of poverty problems. We did this separately for households in different life stages. So we looked at families with children, working age households without children, and pensioner households, and ran the analysis separately for each different, for households in the different life stages. I just want to focus on the child poverty types. We identified 5 child poverty types from the analysis. We tried to give them names. It kind of gives you indication of the kinds of problems they have. Obviously, that's very difficult. We're defining these households and their poverty in a multi-dimensional way. They've got lots of things going on, so it's tried to, it's very hard to capture that in a snappy name. That's the incidence of the different poverty types that we found. In terms of what they look like, in terms of a description of the kind of poverty situation that they're facing, a quick summary here. So, for example, we found a poverty type who we labelled the grafters. So these were couple families in working in low-paid jobs, some of whose employment likely to have been hit by the recession, but they valued work, felt they were coping financially. And I'm putting a bit more meaning into their kind of situation there, and this is a combination of the statistical data that identified the types and the qualitative data. That when we went and spoke to those families, we could dig a bit deeper into their circumstances. We found a type that we called the vulnerable mothers. So these tended to be young single parents with young children out of work, low skills, living in social rented housing, and they had particular concerns about moving off benefits and making work pay due to childcare costs. But not all single mothers were the same. So we found another group called Managing Mothers. They tended to be slightly older set of single mothers, more engaged with the labour market, who employed very strict financial procedures to get by, and so on and so on. So the different types, we've done a report that goes into a lot of detail about the different types, and what we've also produced is a website which has, again, some infographics in it that enables you to visualise the different kinds of poverty that our different poverty types have. So you can sort of click over these graphics and it shows you what the indicators are and the sort of likelihood that a particular type has them. And when you flick around, switch from one type to the other, you can see how, in these spoke charts, the sort of distribution of poverty indicators changes. So this is all on this nice website that Demos put together, so I'd recommend going and having a look at that. And of course, it's not just got the child poverty breakdown on there, it's got it for households without children and pensioners. So in terms of what we think the research is telling, well, we think it provides this rich source of data that segments income poor households and really highlights the fact that different types of poverty exist, and there's income poor households out there with quite different experiences of poverty. So this obviously prevents people from viewing poverty as a homogenous sort of low-income group, and it also raises awareness and tackles misconceptions about people in poverty. So for example, they're not all out of work or not engaged with the labour market. But importantly, we think it helps guide policymakers and practitioners to not only target different types of poor households, but come up with tailored policy solutions that suit the circumstances and experiences of different types of households in poverty. I mean, what we haven't really done is come up with a new measure. We've come up with a sort of more detailed segmentation of low-income households, and there's the resources on the website to really, have a look and dig into what these different types of poverty are. But having done the research, and although we kind of threw lots of poverty indicators together to create this segmentation and this description, which I think is the right way to do what we did, it becomes clear that you can look at the indicators that we use in different ways. So some potentially are sort of causes or drivers of poverty, and others are sort of characteristics of poverty, and some of the other things are even sort of outcomes, what happens to households having been in poverty for a while. And in terms of making some distinctions around how you measure these different indicators for the consultation, I think the first thing we want to say is that we think the existing poverty indicators are good ways of measuring and monitoring levels of poverty if you think poverty is about lacking access to material resources. And so, low income and material deprivation are good indicators for doing that. And that, of course, there's issues about how they're measured and how you present those, which Matt and to some extent Peter's already talked about. But we think they're, good, established, internationally renowned measures of poverty that should stay. Some of the other indicators mentioned in the consultation potentially sort of confuse measuring poverty per se with sort of characteristics of poverty, so other things that can sort of happen and occur alongside poverty that really help illustrate the lived experience, so things like debt and bad housing. And further still, some other sort of commonly used indicators of poverty are more suited to being termed poverty outcomes, we think, so sort of later scarring effects of living in poverty and show the consequences of living in poverty, so things to do with sort of child development and aspirations and well-being. But where we think the consultation can really make a difference, and I think others think along the same lines, is by focusing on these drivers of poverty. So these are things that directly or indirectly increase someone's risk of being in poverty. So things like worklessness and underemployment and low pay and low skills and things like that. And potentially, there's, one could argue that you could look at these multidimensionally, because it's bound to be the case that households have more than one of these drivers, and highly likely that if you have more than one of these poverty drivers, your risk of poverty increases quite substantially. So again, we think focusing particularly on these drivers with an explicit link to poverty as defined according to low income and deprivation can really help drive policy that's attempting to reduce people's risk of being income poor. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, we've got John Veit-Wilson, and John is going to spend, he's got a role as a discussant here, so responding really to everything that's been put forward so far. And so he has 20 minutes. And just to help him, because 20 minutes is a bit longer, I'll give you a sort of 5-minute warning towards the end, just so you know where you are. Thank you, John.
Thank you. I was asked to discuss the responses to the consultation document. And what I've got to say rather does take it for granted that you know what was in that, though a number of those points have been picked up by the speakers so far. So you must understand what I'm going to read, because that's the only way I can stick to time, is largely about the document, picking up occasionally points which have been made, in agreement as well as with disagreement. I've got to start by giving a brief background to the subject as a whole, because you can only understand the responses against the background of a century's development of robust and reliable social science methods for conceptualizing, defining, and measuring poverty. And I've worked on that for half that time. People who aren't familiar with the subject often don't grasp that measuring poverty isn't the same subject as policies against poverty. Anyway, some governments see combating poverty as an extra expense, not as a defense of human rights. However strongly we feel about concepts or policies, we must deal with them separately. What I'm going to say is drawn from many of the responses, mainly the social science ones. This is a brief review, not a survey. In short, the expert responses were largely critical on the two principal grounds that the dimensions were not poverty indicators, but conditions suffered across society, and that a composite index of disparate items is meaningless. The consultation document wanted to arrive at one. For that reason, and because we understand matters are now on hold, I'm not going to talk about how these proposed measures fit with current statutory measures. They don't. It's hard to know, the responses suggested, who could have believed this document was methodologically credible? But governments have always chosen the forms of science congenial to their ideologies. The problem goes back for centuries. Think of Galileo and Copernicus. Governments may choose to reject science in favor of belief. I'm sure you're all aware of the sort of thing I mean, exemplified by the Justice Secretary's recent response to an official pressing him to pilot the privatization of the probation service. You don't pilot a revolution. Now, this document reflects just one view of society, presented in stratified terms of we the people and they the poor as two distinct identifiable human groups. There's no evidence for this notion, and it's an offensive distinction. Incidentally, Sergeant Shriver, who was active in the war against poverty in the USA, was parodying it. He was not supporting the idea of that distinction. He's saying that's the way so many people talk about it. Now to foundations. Discussion is futile without agreement on which of the many disparate approaches to conceptualizing and identifying poverty we're talking about. Professor Spicker distinguished a dozen different ways of talking about poverty, while my own work in 10 different countries suggested 7 distinct discourses. What's notable is that this document doesn't seem aware that this is an issue at all. It assumes agreement that poverty is what the DWP asserts. This suggests ignorance of the generally accepted standard social science approaches. That's one of 2 background issues raised in many responses. One is what is meant by poverty. The other is what consultations have previously taken place and what measures are currently in use, which this document wishes to supersede. We've heard a little about this. So, first of all, what is meant by poverty? Many books have been written on conceptualizing and defining poverty, and there's no time for all that now. Here's how the World Bank Guide to Concepts and Methods defines it. Poverty can be said to exist in a given society when one or more persons do not attain a level of material well-being, we agree about that, deemed to constitute a reasonable minimum by the standards of that society. UN committees are hardly radical, and this compromise definition talks about poverty as a long-term deprivation of the resources, capabilities, choices, security, and power necessary for the enjoyment of an adequate standard of living and other civil, cultural, and economic and political and social rights. A succinct formulation of these definitions of poverty is an enforced lack of socially perceived necessities. Few people would disagree with these simple definitions. Be absolutely clear, the standard understandings of poverty are as a lack of necessary resources not to be poor. They are not about squalor and behavior in spite of adequate resources, as this document implies. That fantasy was disproved by Seabohm-Rowntree's pioneering scientific research at the end of the 19th century and many since. To disprove this, you have to show that household resources are, on average, adequate as social science defines adequacy. You can't blame behavior if they aren't. There are several reliable and robust methods to discover what societies consider are necessities, which everyone should have. That's the basis of minimum adequacy standards. It's a matter for science and not for assertion. They can't be dismissed as simply matters of subjective individual opinion. Every politician and pollster knows that the aggregation of a lot of individual opinions, however stupid and subjective, makes an objective social fact. That's what drives election propaganda and voting behavior. How poverty and adequacy are conceptualized in society are also social facts. Social scientists have known this since the 19th century. So what's the existing situation? Many of the responses point out that the current measures already met the stated objectives of not being based on a single measure of income alone, but include other dimensions. But the real point is that it's not long since we were consulted on better measures. Before the DWP's 2002 consultation, the Common Social Security Committee, as it was then called, held an inquiry in 2000 covering the adequacy of the benefit system, which accepted that lack of income is not the only dimension of poverty and social exclusion. It recommended that the government should fund research and commission experts to assist it to devise publicly acceptable measures of the levels of income needed to avoid poverty. The 2010 Act's 4 measures were based on consultations. Respondents agreed that both the experience of poverty has many dimensions and that the single headline measure of poverty, households at risk of poverty if their incomes fell below 60% of median equivalized household incomes, is not a criterion of minimal income adequacy. We are all agreed on that. The percentile is an arbitrary social indicator for comparing income distributions between countries and over time. That's what it was devised for. But it can't tell us anything about what poverty is in any one country at any one time. It could be more or it could be less. A social indicator like this one is a milepost, not a goalpost. In this country, the research evidence has been for years that the minimum level of living can only be achieved on average on incomes well above 70% of median. That's why the 2010 Act includes 70% as one of its targets, as well as indices of material deprivation. Measures widely accepted on expedient, if not completely on methodological grounds. However, the document seems to reject the 2010 measures because they fail to include descriptions of what Mr. Duncan Smith believes are the root causes of poverty. I'm quoting him here. family breakdown, educational failure, addiction, debt, and worklessness and economic dependency. Many responses remarked on how the document confuses the consequences of poverty with its causes, and there's no doubt that poverty does exacerbate many of these common conditions, which are found right across society, even among the royal family. So whatever the case for describing some of the consequences and associations, that's no more than someone's beliefs about causes and doesn't reflect what the empirical evidence shows. This year, Mr. Duncan Smith was reported by the Financial Times as protesting that a report on another topic was unduly weighted towards the evidence. That's a pity, since his 2010 speech wanted a clear and evidence-based outcome. He's not the only minister publicly criticised for finding it hard to distinguish beliefs from statistical facts. So it looks as if this isn't just a simple technical matter of methodological disagreements, but of profound epistemological conflict on ideological grounds. There's no time for detailed analysis, so I'll take the document's 8 dimensions and briefly summarize the comments on them. There are 3 logical groups. Those dimensions which are personal and not poverty-related, those which are structural and environmental and not personal, and those which are personal economic issues. So the first one, these are the groups in the discussion document which are treated as being causal and indicators of poverty. Family stability is not an indicator of poverty. As we've heard, the majority of poor children live in couple households. Unstable relationships and changing household compositions are found right across society. While bad health and disability may lead to loss of earnings, that's a reflection on the inadequacy of social security benefits for sick and disabled people. Inadequate income may cause malnutrition to children as well as to parents. The large majority of poor children don't have sick or disabled parents. Addiction is equally a problem for rich people like the millionaire Rousings. You remember what happened to Mrs. Rousing. In any case, it's very hard to get any reliable data on substance abuse. It's not a sign of poverty. If lack of skills means lack of parenting skills, there's no evidence that it's confined to people in poverty or is any indicator of poverty. It's found right across society. If it means lack of occupational skills, it falls into the structural group. The document confuses the description of being workless with that of being unemployed. Several responses emphasized the importance of recognizing unpaid work and its gendered distribution. Don't forget, most people's highest ambition is to win the lottery and be able to choose whether to be employed or not. Rich people are not impoverished by their lack of work. They employ others to do it for them. So the real issue in identifying poverty isn't worklessness at all, but the inadequate incomes households get from low-paid employment or from social security benefits, or as was pointed out, irregular and part-time employments, things of that kind. The critical issue for measuring poverty is whether household income in or out of work is adequate. Further, respondents saw unemployment as caused by lack of skill-specific, localized labor market demand and not by lack of willpower to take available jobs. There weren't any. There aren't any. It's an elementary point, but one which the document ignores. Lack of labor market demand for employees with specific skills is not an identifier of poverty at all, but of structural constraints, preventing people from escaping poverty. As graduate unemployment shows, lack of skills doesn't cause poverty. As for the implication of cultures of transmitted unemployment, intensive empirical research over many years has totally failed to find any evidence of it. There's a lot of hearsay and there is no evidence. But these are zombie beliefs you can't kill with evidence. Occupying inadequate housing in terms of conditions, space, and amenities is most certainly a deprivation. but it's a consequence of poverty and not a cause. In any case, what's meant by poor neighbourhoods or schools is greatly disputed. These are public goods and beyond the control of individual households. The evidence since the Plowden report is that most people living in what are described as poor neighbourhoods are not poor, and most poor people don't live in poor neighbourhoods. As for what a poorly performing school, that's a matter for ideologists and educationalists. It has no place as an indicator of poverty, since it's another condition suffered from children in those schools, irrespective of their family income situation. Finally, we come to the third group, the personal economic dimensions. Respondents commonly agreed that the current social indicator was not the best single measure. Again, we're all agreed on that. Many supported the multidimensional 2010 package, which includes material deprivations. Or they emphasized there are already much better empirically based measures of necessary income to meet minimum social standards of adequacy. What's needed are minimal adequacy measures with the incomes necessary to achieve them, but they're not mentioned in the document. The document gives emphasis to the importance of the sources of income, but there's no evidence of a causal relationship between the source of household incomes and children's outcomes, though income level does directly matter. As most responses mentioned, the majority of adults and children in poverty by the low-income measure live in households earning their low pay, not in unemployed ones. Unmanageable debt is a problem for everyone whose irreducible expenditure exceeds their incomes and finds it hard to manage, right across society. Even the Duchess of York suffered from it, along with lacking skills and being a single mother. That didn't make her poor. Debt may be a consequence of poverty, but it's certainly not a cause. To conclude, given that Mr. Duncan Smith announced the decision had already been taken to introduce this plan before the consultation closed, what the document represents is nothing more than a sales pitch, an attempt to market test the idea that you can count the number of poor children in terms of some stereotype beliefs about poor people's characteristics and adding them up into a single number. That's widely criticized as meaningless. Similarly, the claim that the goal is measurement by outcomes is meaningless if the aim isn't to improve preventive policy. There's no sign that the government aims to increase poor people's resources, but quite the opposite. Not surprisingly, the professional and expert responses were uniformly skeptical, if not downright critical. Most didn't put things as bluntly as the principal United Kingdom source of expertise on poverty measurement did, the Poverty and Social Exclusion Research Team at Bristol and some other universities, which is ESRC financed. Few, if any, correspondents seem to have disagreed with their judgment. This consultation document is of very poor quality. It surely cannot have been written by a civil servant. The PSE team went on. The main defect is that it is conceptually completely inept and confused in that it fails to recognize the fundamental distinction between measures of poverty and the characteristics of poor children and the associations and consequences of poverty. So to count the number of poor children, you need to identify the one characteristic which distinguishes their families from those who are not poor. Appearances and associations do not do this. As the PST team put it, child poverty is children in households lacking access to material resources that are understood to be necessary in a given society. We live in a marketized, consumerized society in which by far the most crucial resource, the sine qua non of all the others, is what Mr. Laws, in his introduction to the document, calls the importance of a decent income. Income is what someone called the ultimate multi-purpose policy instrument. And if Mr. Duncan Smith wants a multidimensional measure of child poverty, he should consult the experts who've been developing them for decades, instead of trying to reinvent wheels, and broken ones at that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, John, for really taking us through in detail the government's original consultation document, and it's probably worth saying that the Royal Statistical Society did put in a response, and certainly one of our criticisms was the conflation of causes and associations and outcomes of poverty in that single measure. So many of our concerns echoed the things that John has said. It will be interesting to, I mean, the sense that I got from Peter is that this is being digested at some length, so let's hope that some of those responses have actually gone on to make the department review how they're thinking about the measures. Right, we've got some time for questions and comments for the panel. I think what I'll do, if it's all right, is take 2 or 3 at a time and then allow members of the panel to respond to the bits that they want to. Okay, thanks. Well, let's turn to the panel with those questions. So we've got, what's a reasonable aspiration? What is it that we should be aiming for? A bit more explanation about the dynamic nature of the groups that NatCen's research indicated and the relationships between them. And then something about the purpose of the underlying indicators that we're seeking. Somebody want to kick off?
Well, I felt addressed by both the first and the third questions. Very briefly, you're absolutely right. One has got to build dynamism into any kind of approach. What I was quoting was simply abstract definitions. If you want to concretize them in time and place, you've got to do it in terms of the indicators which the population itself says are those things which everybody in society should be able to have if they want them in order to live a decent life, to be included in society, not to be excluded, not to be treated as poor. Those things change over time. Social surveys allow us to discover what those things are. In this country at the moment, there are 2 research approaches which do that. The minimum income standards research at the University of York, at Loughborough, was partly with York before, funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the poverty and social exclusion research at the University of Bristol, but with Open University and a number of other universities collaborating. They use slightly different methods. The Loughborough one is to get intensive focus groups discussing everything which a family ought to be able to have, which is indispensable for a decent life, and then costing it. So that builds double dynamism in the terms that you were suggesting. One is, the central point is the level of living. It isn't the money at all. We all agree on that point. But the money is what is necessary to support that level of living in terms of individual household expenditure patterns. Therefore, we're not dealing with the structural aspects which are for government or elsewhere. Those dimensions can't be included in that one. The Bristol approach is to build up a long list of such social indicators to discover what proportions of the population in large-scale household surveys have or have not got them, and then to discover the average income levels at which they manage to achieve what are defined. And so that gives you 2 kinds of indicators. Both of them are dynamic, and I hope it's answered the third point as well. Because the indicators are what is necessary for the minimally decent level of living as it's seen in Britain today. And because the Bristol one's been going for a number of years, we now have indications of what the changes are, things that become necessities and then are no longer seen as necessities. A landline telephone's a very good example. That went up, and then it came down because now mobiles are the necessity, but a landline phone isn't any longer. And there are many other examples.
Thank you. Matt, can I bring you in as well now here? I think sort of especially on this last question of what's the purpose, because I picked up from Policy Exchange in a previous discussion that one of your concerns was that the measure isn't actually policy relevant and policy guiding enough. I don't know if that's still something that's...
I think, I guess, coming on the first and third points, and also I'll come to a couple of things that John mentioned. I think in an ideal world, we would have a measure which is perfectly or not perfectly, but accurately identifying living standards. I think that's broadly what we're talking about. I mean, I'll come to your question in a minute, perhaps. I have issues with the current measure because I don't think that income translates into living standards accurately enough. I think the comparisons across different groups, when we account for household composition especially, simply do not translate. And I think there's an issue in that for the minimum income standards as well. And actually, I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the minimum income standard is that measure which calculates how much families need. But is it not then averaged or with the 6% of median income?
No.
I was under the impression it was.
No, it is compared with the 60%.
Okay.
And it finds that at the moment, because of the way living standards are going, you now need about 77%, unless you're a pensioner. Interestingly, the pension guarantee gives you what the British population considers is the minimum decent level of living for a pensioner household without dependents.
In that case, I think it's the living wage that does that. It introduces the...
Living wage has other problems,
Yeah.
I agree. I wasn't talking about the living wage.
Okay. But I think we come back to this issue of income, and what I believe we should be trying to measure is living standards. Now, that's a relatively vague point. I think the most interesting response that I saw myself was the IFS response, which had a consumption measure. And through doing that, it accounted for a lot of difference in assets and also, to a certain extent, the different requirements of different types of households. In terms of should it be guiding policy or should it be a kind of a measure in itself or a genuine measure of living standards, I think in an ideal situation we would have something which we were happy with as a measure of what we consider living standards to be, and we would have a threshold of what is broadly accepted as enough. I think the current measure is a long way away from doing that. And so if the government were to adopt something, especially given the consultation document, I would agree with most of the criticisms. But given that, it read in a way of, here is what the Department for Work and Pensions or the Secretary of State is after, here's what he's trying to solve. And to do that, you need a completely separate measure. I think in that world, you may end up with a flawed measure of living standards or poverty, and then a measure which allows for them to address what they want to address. I mean, they could read that as what they consider poverty to be. I think it's more the range of factors they have an issue with, things like debt and family composition. I don't agree that those are things we should be looking for, but that's broadly what we recommended, because the consultation was effectively asking for the way to do that.
I mean, this quest to measure living standards echoes very much the debate, again, in international development, kicked off particularly by Matejic about capabilities, which was a kind of mysterious word that nobody quite understood what it meant, and has led to lots of quests about how to measure it. And I haven't seen very many successful approaches on how to do it. I mean, nutrition has been one of the examples, I think, but often you do then end up back with income measures, I think. So there's some lessons to be learned, I think, from the international development scene. Matt, do you want to respond in particular to the question around the linkages between the different groups? Are they static? Is there some dynamism, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks for your question. We haven't looked at that in the research, but we've got a research proposal in that is, if funded, so if you come back this time next year, hopefully we'll have done that research exactly as you've suggested. So we think it'd be really interesting to see whether people stay in these types over time. If they move out of these types, do they escape poverty completely, or do they move into other types? And what are the factors that are associated with people moving in and out of the types? And you'd expect to see, I think, different factors associated with different types, or different combinations of factors anyway. So because the data set we use is longitudinal understanding society, we can look at these dynamics. So yeah, we have a research proposal in at the moment to do that. And we'd also include, qualitative research in that, where hopefully we can follow up households from the survey. So literally use the statistical work to identify households, that have moved out of type A, and then go and interview those households and say, it looks like you've moved, it looks like your circumstances have changed, and verify that, and then check that we've identified the factors, and then speak to them in more depth about that. So yeah, hopefully this time next year we'll have a presentation that talks about that kind of thing.
Thank you. And finally, just to Peter, if we can bring you in from the sort of policy perspective, in particular those first and third questions, what's the purpose and what could we reasonably aspire to measure?
Yeah, and I suppose also just to say sort of, we can talk about 100 years of poverty research, and I think definitely that's true. But it is very much an evolving field. So, for instance, material deprivation came in after Peter Townsend about 1979, sort of, and then the Poverty and Social Exclusion Survey followed Breadline Britain in the mid-80s. European poverty statistics were synchronised in 2004. The minimum income standards was developed in 2008. So it isn't as though sort of it's a closed book and all of those things have been solved. So, and as part of the team that built the consultation and a civil servant, you know, it was genuinely an earnest attempt to try and sort of look below the bonnet and see sort of, well, what constitutes poverty in this day and age. And what you can see out there is that the current definition does not resonate that much with the public. And there is only finite resources, and what we were trying to do and what we are trying to do with our new measures is focus on those people who need help to get out of poverty, who wouldn't be able to get out on their own steam. And certainly in all the meetings of ministers and special advisors that I've been in, that's been the focus. And so when I talk about entrenched poverty, it is about trying to work out, you know, there's a huge amount of churn in poverty. After 1 year, almost half the people who were in poverty the last year aren't in poverty this year. So if you help those people and they're already out anyway, well, what's, you know, you've wasted your very scarce resources at this point. So I think there is a genuine need with all the scarce resources and with constraints, whatever happens in the future, to work out who most needs help. And that most needs help is poverty now, because we know the longer somebody's in poverty, the worse it is. And in the future, sort of about people, we know that people who grow up in poverty are much more likely to be in poverty as adults. And that's what we were trying to do, and those are the purposes of what we're trying to work out with the consultation.
So two quite important points there about the purpose, one around policy guidance, but also I think something that we haven't discussed really, which is the sort of symbolic nature of indicators and public acceptability. And this links to some research we heard about at the conference earlier in the week, also from NatCen, about public attitudes to welfare, which really have been getting harder over time. So I think it's an important part of the debate. I'm just going to bring John in again to...
Just a very quick footnote. What Peter says is absolutely right, but it does point up this difference between the policy uses of a statistical measure like this and the measurement purposes of it. What I was talking about was the measurement purposes. And there's an old paradox that what politicians want is accuracy. We had it mentioned by one of the Mats a moment ago, but not necessarily, they want, precision, but not necessarily accuracy, whereas what we can offer is reliability, but not necessarily precision. And the trouble is the politicians can't make their benefit rates and so on if they haven't got precision. But then it never meets absolutely everybody's. It may meet nobody's, because we all know about multipolar distributions and all the rest of it. It meets some sort of point somewhere in the middle. We're dealing normally with the public capacity to understand roughly averages and not even know the difference between different kinds of averages. So there are all sorts of problems which people like Peter have to struggle with in making policy out of the kinds of measures which are statistically reliable, even if only indicators and not precise points.
Sure.
And that's understood in the methodological field. It's not always understood by the politicians, though.
I think we've got time for one more round of questions if there's appetite in the room. The mic doesn't seem to be forthcoming, so I think just speak up.
I was wondering why there was no talk on, so we saw some regional disparities in what is poverty or how many people live in poverty, right? I'm assuming that if you live in London, you probably need more money to live at a certain level of standard, and is there no adjustment for that in the measure of relative low income?
Okay, so regional impacts, we'll come back to that. Any other contributions?
So it's really more on the use point. One of the questions in the from speakers, but I'd be interested to hear a bit more from the panelists to how things will be different with these measures. What kind of different things might be done?
Sure. So the uses of a multidimensional measure. One final contribution or question? Or is lunch is calling, I see. Okay, well, why don't we wrap it up with these last two questions, and if panelists also want to make any final remarks at this stage as well. So the two things on the table are, are there regional disparities, as it were, or local disparities, and also what's the use of a multidimensional indicator if we have one? So where should we start with, Matt?
Okay. We didn't look too much at regional disparities in our project just because we didn't really have big enough numbers of people in different regions to really get into that. So I'll say a bit more about the multidimensional measure. I guess, as Peter suggests, you can dig a bit deeper with multidimensional measure, I think. It's a bit like the research that we did. So I think segmentation of a multi-dimensional measure is useful. People have already criticised grouping together lots of indicators and coming up with a number, and then what do you do with that? There are multi-dimensional measures of poverty, international development ones, and what they tend to do is then break them down again and to see how those various indicators fit together. And that's kind of what we did in our project, and I think that's quite useful. Types and targeting and things like that, and that can be done to some degree with the one of the existing measures. So the income and material deprivation measure is sort of multi-dimensional, but there isn't much sort of digging deeper into that measure, and I think there's worth doing that. The data exists and could be presented, and people could use that. And I kind of think, as I suggested at the end of my presentation, having a multi-dimensional measure of poverty drivers might be really useful, just because of the notion that individuals and households have more than one poverty driver, and knowing the number they have and the types of drivers they have would be informative in targeting and working out particular policy solutions suited to particular households.
Thank you. Matt?
So on the regional impacts, I think the impacts I showed you, I think, are clear. There are the issues. London's the easy example. Cost of living is higher, and there is no equivalisation for that in the measure, and therefore, we I think underestimate the problem. What we don't quite see, I think Resolution Foundation tried to estimate, but more on a cost of living basis rather than looking at this debate. A lot of sub-regional impacts as well, and a lot of urban-rural differences. So I think that's a weakness, and in my view, if you get past an income measure, you might be able to address that more successfully. Although, of course, the IFS's consumption measure has still got a pound side by it, so whether you address that or not, I'm not sure. Whether it will be addressed, I'm not sure. What we want a multi-dimensional measure for, I kind of repeating my point earlier, to me, the consultation document read as if it simply was asking for something that would guide a set of kind of concerns. I agree that there was no real foundation of those issues in the evidence of what drives living standards. Whilst some of it mattered, all of it mattered in some level, some of it being a very small one. I think maybe stepping back to more the political point, I think, and the reason maybe that this came out and that people like Ian Logan Smith have been focusing on it, I think there's been a frustration for a while, particularly on the centre-right, if not entirely, maybe excluding Frank Field, on the centre-right, that the media and political discourse was based around this one measure. And this one measure had hugely distorted incentives, and frankly, we can see, you only have to release the emergency budget in 2010 to see the Chancellor George Osborne saying that they were increasing child tax credits so that the other reforms they were bringing into place would have no impact on child poverty. So this one headline measure is feeding directly into policy, and it's also getting the front page of a lot of different certain papers, I guess. And so I think there was a frustration that led to this multidimensional measure, which picked up the things thereafter. And yeah, I kind of appreciate that there's this basket of measures. I don't think any of them individually tell us enough, or as a group it tells us enough. But at the same time, I think if you're looking for something which is robust, statistically robust, and identifies something we really want, I think the multi-dimensional measure is probably, from an analysis point of view and from a statistician's point of view, probably not going to get us very far. Although there's, material deprivation measure is in many respects multi-dimensional. We know there are surveys out there, and there's academic evidence which use a broader range. I'm tempted to ask the question, why can't we just get a better measure of material deprivation as a start? Because frankly, the current one's relatively narrow.
Thank you. Peter?
I suppose in terms of the current statistics, there is a before and after housing costs, relative and absolute, and material deprivation, which gives them some degree of London difference. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies a few years back, when they did their report, did a cost of living adjusted poverty lines as well. It's just very hard to get, as Matt says, even within a region, you'll get quite a disparity in terms of distance from your nearest shop and how much that shop costs. So there's some bits, but it's very hard to actually pin down. In terms of use of the multi-dimensional measure, as I say, what we were trying to do is to find the hardest to reach who was stuck down there and to try and break the intergenerational cycle. And I think across all of the consultation responses, we have seen sort of the groupings of the causes and the effects and so forth, and we are taking stock and taking them all very seriously. So that's what hopefully watching this space will yield a view of.
Thank you. John?
Yes, thank you. I just comment that I don't think that discussions of work incentives have anything to do with the question of measuring child poverty. That's a different kind of question. But the multidimensional aspect of the lives that people live is very important indeed, and the social research methods which are used to discover what are the minimum adequate levels of living in this country do take many dimensions into account. So if you start there and discuss what goes into those dimensions, given that the dimensions are derived from surveys themselves, they're tested, obviously. They have to start in someone's head, but they've been tested and very well worked out. They are what the population says. They're not just our speculations about it. As far as regional variation is concerned, the minimum income standards work has in fact tested that its approach in a number of different areas, rural as against urban, and also in Northern Ireland to see if they needed a different standard. And the answer was that the differences were so small that from the point of view of public acceptability and comprehension, it wasn't worth making the distinction. But that's again one of those examples where one tailors one's findings to what can be communicated. And then we get into some of these grey and sometimes rather grubby areas. There used to be a belief that it was cheaper to live in the country than it is to live in the town. That's probably reversed now because we know a great deal more about the necessity for private transport in the rural areas, about the costs of fuel, the higher costs of food, and so on. In the 1930s, it was believed that unemployment benefit could be lower in the countryside because all the working class people getting it would be able to grow their own vegetables. We don't have those kinds of simplistic beliefs now, I hope. It is something which can be studied empirically, but if you're trying to devise standard practicable income maintenance measures, which is the different question where you get into the arguments about incentives, then you have to take account of what you're trying to cover. And with some things like housing, which has just been mentioned, you may have to cover it completely separately because it's too variable to be included in a single form of benefit. That's just one example. The number of children is another example. But these are questions which have been studied by the researchers in the field for a long time, and we do have answers to them, and we're looking forward to more work with government in actually doing something sensible about this field. Thank you.
Well, thanks. That's a nice note for us to start wrapping things up. And I think the one thought that comes to my mind from all of this discussion, other than the kind of, the back and forth about the different measures, is a kind of classic RSS point, which is that the use value of these statistics is in the user community. And so actually part of the fight over this measure is to do with what are we trying to use it for? Is it how the public perceive it? Is it to guide policy, or is it for international comparability, and so forth? And actually, that's part of the sort of tension over what it's the kind of symbolism of that measure, which is very important and underlies it. Could you help me thank our panel one last time before we break for lunch? Thank you.